I'm just fitting this flush bolt into these set of secret doors for this kitchen project I'm working on. I've got to make a router jig to cut this in so it perfectly matches the faceplate of this this bolt here, and it's really tricky to do this using traditional methods. But I've got a way of making this really nice and simple I'm going to share with you in this video. So I've actually already machined this door and made a jig to do this job, but I thought I'd make it a cracking video to share because it's a really useful technique for any shape of ironmongery. So the basic concept of it is we take the item that we're going to be routering or letting into the piece of wood, and we glue pieces of wood around it. So a nominal thickness board, so MDF, plywood, anything like that. Better quality that you've got, the better, because we're going to be using the edge of the material to run the router bearing on. And we're doing exactly like I just said, we're just gluing the pieces of wood around the fitting that we want to chop in, and then we can use a proper little router bit like this. If you've not got one of these, you really need to get hold of some. I've got routers that just permanently keep these bits in. They're a top bearing flush trimming router bit for sort of templates that you can router this stuff in with. I used to struggle to make a jig for these. I would measure the overall length of this here, work out what drill bit would make the curve on the end, try and drill them perfectly sort of distanced apart to make a jig that looked like this, and then try and cut the pieces out in the middle nice and parallel. All of that is pretty tricky. Trying to get the holes the right distance apart can take you 2 or 3 attempts. There's not a lot you can do to then adjust the width if you get that wrong, and trimming the bit out in between nice and straight is also a fair challenge. It just takes time to do, whereas this method is incredibly quick. This bolt has got a full curved radius, which is nice and easy, but you don't have to have that. You can make a bespoke sort of scribed, if this is just an oval rather than a full circle. We can cut that in by hand, but luckily we've got a drill bit here that fits the perfect size. That's going to be pretty useful as a starting point. Now if you're thinking that's lucky, but what if you don't have a drill bit that's the right size? There'll be a drill bit either too big or too small away from the item, and always go slightly too small, and then you can use something like this. This is my really simple small piece sanding jig, so it's like a sanding drum with some pretty coarse sandpaper on there, and say this needed a 1mm bigger diameter hole than I can get from this drill bit. Just get some like 80 grit paper, tape to a drill bit, and you can make your own little sanding drum, and just 15-20 seconds of sanding, you've enlarged that hole big enough to fit the jig, and we can just sort of keep measuring until we get there. So it's really easy to make that bigger and suit if you've not got the right size drill bit. The key, like I said, with this is to use some nominal thickness material. Got a bit of fairly cheap plywood here, so I can add to this jig if I need to from another piece. It's the same thickness throughout. We need a nice flush top to this thing to run the router on. I'm just going to start with a drill hole. I've got a Forstner bit here that I think is the exact right size, so we're just going to get a hole through the centre of this piece of wood. I'm just going to draw a little line through the centre of that hole that I've drilled. It is important that hole is drilled nice and square to the face of the board, because the router bearing is going to follow it at potentially different depths. So if you drilled at a bit of an angle, drilled that by hand on site, then you might have varying results from this. I'm just going to rip the piece of timber down through the middle of that hole with the thinnest blade that I've got available, which is this little bandsaw. I'd like to introduce the sponsor of this video in Jackery. They're a portable power and solar generation company. This is their brand new Jackery Explorer 3000 power bank. It's got a huge 3072 watt hour capacity with a maximum output of 3.6 kilowatts, which is absolutely huge. Like I say, this is brand new to the UK market. It's only just gone on the website. And this model interests me because it does absolutely everything that I would need from a power bank like this. When I'm working, I quite often hook my tools up to a dust extractor, and when you combine the load of the dust extractor and the tools starting up, they just about fall under that 3600 watt max output. They don't hold it forever, but this is exciting because it is a power bank. It will do absolutely everything that I could ever need from a tool like this. So just give a quick overview of what this thing is. It's essentially a huge battery pack that you can plug 240 volt and all your 12 volt accessories in as well. So the reason this is cool is because it's got a pure sine wave 240 volt. That means it's not going to damage any of your sensitive electronics, which I've seen quite a few people struggling with hoovers and vacuums, and power tools that all have microprocessors inside now that control how they're working. If you're using them away from a power source and perhaps off a generator, it can cause a lot of trouble with their machines and they don't last very long. So that is a really important feature, and it's good to have it on there. So safe to use this with all the power tools that I've got in the workshop. We've got a DC 12 volt for like your cigarette lighters and anything that would just plug into your normal car. Really cool, there's a high power USB-C, so 100 watt max USB-C port on there. Pretty much everything seems to be powered through a USB-C now. So to have a 100 watt outlet for one of them is that's pretty fast. That's going to charge your phone up rapid style. Normal USBs as well, which frustrating now is that a lot of things just come with a USB-C. If you've got dedicated normal USB-A leads, then that can be a little bit annoying. So there's loads of connectivity on there. And then the important bit for me is the 230 volt, 240 volt side on here. So we're going to be just testing that out in the workshop in a second. It's charged up with just a regular 3-pin plug on sort of like a kettle lead. Very simple. It charges about 1.7 kilowatt hours, so about 2 hours, and it's fully charged off of a household outlet. You can also charge this up if you're living off grid or away from home for a long period of time. There's a DC input here, and this is where this thing gets really clever. You can put a solar panel attached to this and it will charge itself up from the sun. That is a really cool feature if you're working away from home or camping for an extended period of time. And when you are charging this up, there's not loads of noisy fans running. It's really quiet, just trickling away in the background. Let's have a little play with this in the workshop. So I'm plugging in my extractor here, my workshop extractor. I think that's 1200 watt motor. And then this is the heftiest saw that I've got in the workshop. It's 2300 watts of max power. So what I would normally do is run these two together, and you can't do that on a normal sort of generator. It's too much of a load when it starts up. So let's see how it copes with the Jackery. So the saw is connected to the vacuum that's connected to the outlet on the Jackery. Just fire that up, see what happens. I've got a bit of framing timber here, a bit of 2x4 tannalised. I'm going to do a couple of cuts and see what rating comes on the screen. So yeah, seemingly the startup voltage with the hoover and the saw starting at the same time is the most output. It's handled that fine. When it's cutting, it's actually using less power than that startup. So we go, that was a successful little test, but you might think it's difficult to get excited about a battery pack, but this thing is really cool and I'm looking forward to putting it through its paces. So that's going to be a true circle that I've not had to drill two of them perfectly spaced apart to meet the diameter. All I can do now is just open that up, put the bolt in between, and it gives me the perfect ends to my router jig. And all I need to do is just measure the gap between them with my nice new trend calipers. 75.68. I'm going to call that 75.5, I think. And then using some of the same thickness material as them end pieces, cut some blocks to that measurement that then perfectly fit between and around the thing that you're chopping in. We've got a really quick and accurate template like so, and I've never made a template like that so easily than before I used this technique. And I mentioned at the start that it didn't have to be a perfectly true curve on the end of that bolt there. If that was a slightly oval shape, then we could either use a drill bit to get near and scribe that in place. But the scribing has only got to happen from the sort of flat face here, just around the curve. So once you've got that perfectly matching and scribed in to suit whatever it is that you're chopping in, you can just glue them square pieces around it. It's a really simple process, and it's adaptable to literally any piece of ironmongery I've come across. I've been able to chop in using this method. Quick example, here's another one that I made for the little keep on the end. A bit of a nightmare to chop in something like that normally, and within 10 minutes I'd made and chopped this in using this jig here. So a little fence glued on, and literally just put that in place, put it on the door where I needed to. I then ended up packing it up to the right so it landed in the centre, but you can see that process is really quick and simple. And that one was made using the same method. I did actually have to enlarge that hole using the sandpaper because I've got nothing. It's a 20mm or 20.5mm width plate on that one, which is a bit unusual, a 19mm drill. So I just enlarged that one before I glued these side pieces on, but it works really well. So to assemble this thing, you're going to want some fast setting super glue, so like mitre activator kit. This is a Timco one, but it's available in all sorts of different brands. And you just spray the activator on one side of the component, and you just put the glue on the other side. Just normal super glue, and it just makes it set incredibly fast. Depending on how porous the material is that you're using, you want a little bit more glue sometimes. So I'm just going to line these things up. Get my piece of ironmongery in place. Try and keep everything nice and square. Go down the edge of that bolt, push them together. And just hold it in place while that sets. You want to hold it for a few seconds, but then start. Just give it a little wiggle while you're doing it, otherwise you glue it down to the baseboard by any glue that's squeezed out underneath. There we go, that's set nicely. It's pretty strong, this stuff, it's good enough for a router jig. And I just work our way around doing that for all 4 sides. So using the actual item itself to glue around so you know you've got a perfect fit. I like to keep it fairly tight, but don't press on it so hard that it's a incredibly tight fit, because if there's any intolerance in your router cutter and bearing, then it makes it even tighter as well, so it won't fit. So slightly looser is better than way too tight, I've found. Try and get it all as flush as possible across the joints. That's where making it from the same piece of material is really helpful. I've literally made some of these from pieces of lath on site before when I've needed something in an emergency, so it really is quite adaptable. As long as you've got some super glue on the van, you're golden. Take any glue squeeze out off the surface so it doesn't affect the router. There we go. Tell me that that's not easier than the method that you might have used. Let's go for a bit of a fancy fence, shall we? Then that's it pretty much. I've used that and just clamped them or screwed them in place many a time in the past for routing things in. If you want to get a little bit fancier, you can add a fence to it so we can measure an offset from these pieces of wood. If you started with nice square bits of wood, obviously only drilled a hole in the middle, we can use a combi square to bring out our centre line. Then we can just work either side of that jig, mark our offset. So we want it's a 60mm door, we want a 30mm offset to get it in the centre. We can then glue a little fence on there or screw that in place and it will be a repeatable, accurate jig that's really quick to make. A little bonus tip for you on screw technology: make sure that you pilot drill the fence so that it doesn't bulge the timber as you put a screw in. It's going to affect the positioning of the jig. If you put a 4mm screw straight into that 18mm board, it's going to swell the board at the screw location. So your screw diameter, these are 3.5mm screws, you want to just measure the inner shank of the screw. So it's a 2.35 solid shank in the middle. We need a drill bit that's bigger than that so that it doesn't swell the timbers. We only get the thread of the screw pulling everything together. So I'm going to look for a 2.5mm drill, pilot drill at that size, and then my fence here should be perfectly attached without swelling it at all. Have a quick look now at how that jig has worked out. Put the piece of ironmongery in from the top. You can see it's a pretty good fit around there. I'm happy with that. You just want to check that the inside edges of that jig, where the bearing of the router cutter are going to be running on, are nice and smooth. There's no like holes in the layers of the plywood, else the router will follow them sort of contours. Right, so like I say, I've already machined this in the actual door that I'm working on, but I'll do a test cut on this one. I'll always check these before you go flying into your expensive project. But got a little bit of tannalised in the vise here. I'm going to clamp it through my jig there, to the fence, so there's no screw holes in my workpiece. And then we're going to need that top bearing router cutter. I'll leave a link to these down below in the description, but they're like a 12mm diameter cutter with a bearing that is flush with the sides of the flutes of the cutter there, and that just runs on our jig that we've cut out. And you can do this with a plunge router or a sort of a fixed base router that you can adjust the height of. I don't normally use the plunge, but I've got it out today, and just zeroed that on the top of the workpiece. So from the face of the jig here, poke the cutter down until it touches the workpiece. And then most plunge routers will have some sort of depth rod adjustment, so you can use the ironmongery again, just like this is standard router use really. Sit that on the plunge depth adjuster there. That is the thickness I'm routing this into, because it can sit on these back faces here. So lock that off. And then I'm going to just cut that down in increments from my surface position all the way to that depth there. So about 3mm depth of cut at every stage. I've used a bit of tannalise there. It's not the nicest stuff to try and router. It just gum the cutter up a little bit, but yeah, look at that. That is. That's lovely. It's just really rewarding, isn't it, doing something like that? Just quickly router these lugs down so that we can pop that in so you can see how it turned out. That's all right, isn't it? Yeah, so there we go. It's a really simple little technique for making them jigs, and we can adapt that to pretty much any piece of ironmongery. So just had a route all through my drawer and found this hook bolt. It's like a drop bolt for a garage door. Say if you wanted to let that into a piece of wood, you'd follow a very similar process. Maybe start by scribing these ends in. So cut in a piece of timber that pretty much mimicked that somehow, probably jigsaw that out along this shoulder line. Once you've got them two straight edges here and here, glue a piece of timber around it, and you've got a very quick and easy jig to router them in with. So it is very adaptable. Hinges, latches and all sorts of stuff. And this bolt is going in these secret doors. I'll talk you through these doors in a minute, but I've featured them on the channel already, and I think there's another video due out after this one on the full making of them. But this is the top bolt to secure the left-hand door, and these are quite tall. They're like 2.4 meters tall if you look over here. So the customer wanted a slide bolt, not a flick bolt, because most of the flush bolts are a flick turn, and they're really tricky when you've got long nails to try and operate them. So we wanted a slide bolt, but she's also not very tall, so we needed it a really long length. This is the only bolt I could find that suited the finish types and the spec of what we wanted, with a decent size finger hold there. But it came with a rod that was this length. I think it's about 220 mil overall in the bolt there. So I asked George very nicely on Saturday evening if he would make me a new rod, and he did there, and then he went off on his lathe and milled me out an exact copy in stainless as well. So yeah, we've added about 230 mil onto that bolt, and this is it chopped into the side of this door. These are sort of part way through paint, so there's going to be another couple of sandings and 2 coats of paint on here. But I think what you're meant to do is drill down from the top of the door the length of this original bolt. Then you can sort of wind that rod in from, like drop it in from the top of the door. So you can feed the rod in through the hole you drilled down from the top of the door. It then engages in the back of the slide bolt, and you can thread it in place. That did work on my test piece. I've got one somewhere where I test fitted that. Like I say, we needed the extra length. So I added a little fillet. I routed a slot in the edge of the door. I've put a little removable fillet in. I was in 2 minds as to whether to sand and fill and glue that back in, but I think it looks quite good being serviceable with the sharp edges removed. So I've gone with that option. That's going to be painted. But yeah, they just fit in like so. So we've got that there. I routed this with the fillet in place. There's a little clip of me doing that here. And then, like I say, I've made a fit-in or a jig for the fitting on the end there, and that just holds the top of the bolt, like so. It's not a particularly good fit, but I'm not too bothered. This isn't going to be a bolt that holds a door shut to a door seal. I wanted everything quite nice and loose in terms of the operation of it. It's just so that if someone tries the door, you can physically stop access to that room with this bolt mechanism. So that's how it looks in a real world situation. Quite cool. In fact, it's really cool not seeing a huge piece of silver or whatever finished bolt you're going to use all the way up the edge of the door. Just having that one in the side there is actually quite a nice touch. So we go, finished up with this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out the Jackery if you've not done so already. Oh, after all that, I think we need a cup of tea.